my name is Miriam Coffey. I am a quilter, educator, and all-around sewing enthusiast. And today we're going to talk about minimalist machine embroidery. Now, what exactly is minimalist machine embroidery? It's a way of making my own fabric. I actually get to be my own fabric designer. I get to pick the background, the actual thread, and my design. So let's go into a little bit more detail on how to do minimalist embroidery. So picking a design. What are the best ways to pick a design for minimalist embroidery? All that's really, really important is using a lightly stitched design. You don't want anything too densely stitched out because that's going to add a lot of bulk. Because what we're actually going to do is we're going to cut this up and then piece it into our quilts. So if I had something that was really, really dense, it would make matching my seams up really difficult. Now, another thing I want you to think about is the color choices. With your fabric, you get to choose either a higher contrast or a lower contrast like this by changing the thread and the fabric. So like on this green one here, I've got a really low contrast, more of a monochromatic feel. And this one, I've got a little bit more high contrast, and you can see the design a little bit better, so I'm going to get a completely different look. Now let's talk about stabilizers. When I do minimalist embroidery, I really like to use water-soluble stabilizers. The reason for that is that when I wash it away, all that's left is my thread and my fabric. So it makes my fabric really flexible, and it's going to move like regular fabric. On here, this is the same design. I've already embroidered this out, but I haven't washed it yet. This one I've already washed out, and as you can see, it's going to act and move like normal quilting fabric. Now, you don't have to do just overall designs. You can do images or different shapes, and it can be really fun to do different designs because you can get some really great negative space involved. Just like this design here. When you cut up your design, it's going to look completely different. So this is a set of doilies that I have here. And depending on what the shape of my design, my overall design is going to be, if you have a hard time figuring out what it's going to look like, you can make a viewfinder like this. My final shape is going to be a 3.5-inch square. So I've cut a 3.5-inch square out of a piece of cardstock. And now I can change this and see what my image is going to look like when I selectively cut it. And here's a few of them already stitched out. And so this way, it's a great way of getting some really nice negative shapes involved in your quilts. Now we're actually going to go ahead and cut into our embroidery. So this is an embroidery that I did on my machine, and now all I have to do is unhoop it. So I'm just going to pop this out. I'm going to take my inner hoop out and my outer hoop. I'm just going to set that to the side. Now I'm going to flatten this up a little bit. I can actually, let's tear away any of this excess stabilizer and get this out of the way. Or we can cut it away. This is also a sticky stabilizer, so you can actually see how that's stuck to my fabric. So I'm going to just cut that away. I'm going to peel back my fabric so I don't cut into my actual fabric. I just want to cut my stabilizer away. Now that I've got that stabilizer cut away, let's go ahead and cut this up. So when I use embroidered fabric, since it's kind of precious, since I've worked hard for this, sometimes I like to offset it a little bit just along the edge, and that way any of that extra fabric can go into my seam, and I'm not wasting any extra fabric or adding a lot of bulk to my seams. So I'm going to go ahead and square this up. Now I'm going to rotate it and cut my 3.5-inch strip. Line this up along the edge. Cut that up. So now you can see you can get some really interesting shapes going on. Now that I've got my 3.5-inch square, you can see that you've got some really interesting shapes going on. So now that we have our project already cut up, let's actually go over to the ironing station, and we're going to prep the rest of our fabric for our pillow here. So now that I have my fabric already prepped with my fabric smoothing spray, we're just going to give it a good spray, and we're going to iron it out. And the reason I do this is because when I'm using embroidered fabric, it's going to be a little bit thicker than normal quilting cotton. So that way it's going to be a little bit more balanced when that non-embroidered fabric has a little bit more body. So let's clear this off a bit. So now that I've got my 3.5-inch strip, and I've already actually cut it into a 3.5-inch square over here, and now I'm going to take my marking tool, and what I want to do is I want to make a line, 2 lines that are going to be my stitching lines. I want to mark this the one tip to the other tip, and I'm going to go ahead and draw a 1/4-inch mark on one side. I'm going to go ahead and rotate that, and I'm going to mark the other. This mark is actually going to be my stitching line. So this is one way of making a half square triangle. There are many ways of making half square triangles. This is just the way I chose to do it for this project. So now that I've got this marked up, it's time to pair my embroideries together. So depending on the type of embroidery you've done, if I've done an all over design, it doesn't really matter how I actually pair it up because it's going to be the same design. But what about this piece here? There's a fair amount of negative space. So if I put it this way and sew it along my marking lines, I really wouldn't have much on this side, but there would be a lot going on this side. So if I rotate it this way and pin here and sew along these lines, you can see how I have more designs here and more on the other side. So it's a little bit more balanced, so I'm not losing a lot of embroidery on one side and not the other. So now that I've got that all marked up, I'm going to pair them up, and I'm going to sew along my stitch line. And what that's going to do, I'm now going to cut this in half, and I'm going to create 2 different triangles. I'm going to mark my ruler from one tip to the other to cut this unit into 2 different units. So now we're going to take this to the ironing station. So what I like to do is, I like this little squeeze bottle because what I have is, since I've marked this with my water-soluble marker, if I directly iron this now, what can happen is that mark can become permanent. So I like to use this little squeeze bottle to erase that marker there. But what it also does that's pretty cool is it loosens my fibers, so it allows me to open my seam much easier than if it was dry. So now that I've got my seam open, I'm going to give it a good spray, a good press. And when you press with your iron, don't press directly onto your embroidered fabric, because what that can do is that can smash my stitches, and I don't want that. So press from the non-embroidered fabric. If you do need to press embroidered fabric, I like to use a wool cloth. And this is just a thick, nice wool, and so what I can do is now I can press directly onto my embroidered fabric without worrying about smashing my stitches. So now that I've got this pressed out, let's go ahead and square this up. So I'm going to go ahead and square this up to 3 inches. So now that I've got this squared up, I have a couple over here that are already squared up to 3 inches. Now what I want to do is pair them. So now I've got a couple paired over to my sewing machine, and let's sew them together. So using a walking foot can be really beneficial. This particular walking foot has a guide on it that can be really beneficial to keep my 1/4 inch really nice and straight and not have to worry about it shifting. So now that I've got that paired together, I can go ahead and open this up. So now I have a unit of 2. And now we're going to go and show you how they're going to look when they're all together. And now you can make some really great designs like I've done over here. Now I hope you try machine embroidery on your next quilting project.